Okay, hello everybody. So, I'm just making this short video. Well, I guess it won't be short, but bear with me. This will be a quick video to go over certain ideas for full stack web dev and that I hope will be really helpful to people, especially starting out. So, quick disclaimer, this is based on my experience. There might be, more conventional ways or different viewpoints, but this is from my experience of around 2 years working, almost 3 years working with full stack web dev. So yeah, again, take it with a grain of salt. I'm not a professional. I am self-taught. So yeah. So before we start, I'd like to introduce to you the term tech stack. So this is technically a stack of technologies, right? So the best way to explain a tech stack is, I guess, would be a burger. So, a burger is composed of multiple components, and even if you swap components around, you still know it's a burger, right? But there are some components of a burger that are absolutely essential, like you need the patty and you need the buns, right? And then you could say technically the lettuce and tomato are kind of optional, the sauce is optional, kind of, but it's kind of weird without it also, right? So that's exactly what a tech stack is. It's a group of technologies put together in a certain way so that the end user can consume it well. Wow. So yeah, I think that's the best way to explain it. Because also at the same time, for example, maybe this meat goes well with these tomatoes. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to use those tomatoes, right? You can replace it for onions, for example. And just like tech stacks, it's very varied. There are certain metas, like certain ways, maybe like a McDo burger, but you really can make your own depending on what your preference is and what your job is. Because you don't make a seafood burger for something like this, but it's appropriate in a seafood restaurant. Exactly like tech stacks. So, without further ado, let's actually begin the explanation. So, before we begin, before we begin again, pero there are different parts of web dev, right? The first part is the front end. So the front end is the section of the application that the end user sees. So this is the actual website. It's like the actual things that the user can interact with. So like web apps, desktop applications, Java GUI, those are front end components. And then the opposite of that is the back end. So the back end is all of the logic that the user cannot see. Okay, there's some nuance to it, but that's one way to interpret it. Well, I guess to be more specific, back end refers to things that aren't running on the browser. So front end is more like things on the browser. Back end is things that are not on the browser. So we can explain that a bit more clear. So actually, because the backend is separated into two more parts, we have the server API and we have the database. Let's see if I'm actually recording. Yes, we are. Okay. So the server API is where the actual logic, the processing happens, and the database is where you store things. So not necessarily so that the that so yeah, but yeah, yun. So server API logic, database, storage of permanent persisting data. Okay, so in the front end, the language used is JavaScript. So before we go into what actually you use in front end, let's discuss like what you have to use. So language, I think, is a very important one because front end uses JavaScript because it's a native language of the web, while back end, since it's separate from the front end, it could be something else. Like server API could be Python using something like Django or Flask. Database is SQL, right? You know about that. We've had that in class. So it's kind of fragmented, but people have found ways to make things more cohesive. So for example, in the server API, since again this runs on like a computer rather on the browser, JavaScript normally doesn't run. But people have come up with something called Node.js. So Node.js is a way to run JavaScript in a computer and therefore in a server. So now you can use JavaScript in the front end in the browser, but also in the back end in the server computer. So again, to recap, front end originally just JavaScript, but now JavaScript can be used in back end. Okay, but only half of back end because server API. But how about, did you know that you can also use it for database? This is called an ORM. This is called an Object Relational Mapping Library. We'll go into it a bit more later, but in general, the point of this slide is to show that in modern web stack, in modern web stacks, sorry, it's possible to only use JavaScript slash TypeScript. Okay, I'll go into that a bit later, but the main idea is it's a lot easier now than before, because before you'd have to learn JavaScript, PHP, you have to learn Python, maybe Ruby, SQL, and then there's like a lot of things suddenly at you. But now it's a lot easier, because now all you need to know is JavaScript. TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So whenever you see .ts files or a blue looking JavaScript logo, that's TypeScript. You don't have to worry yourself about that because since it's a superset, all JavaScript code will run on TypeScript. And if you know how to write in JavaScript, it'll take you, 2 hours, and then you can learn how to type in TypeScript. Okay, so let's go to the actual, back to the slide. Let's go to the actual technologies you'll use now. Because that was just the environment, right? That was just the language you're using. Now what are the devices, literary devices? Wow. So before what you'd probably heard of already are these two. So first we have the JavaScript front-end framework, and then we also have a server framework. So a JavaScript front-end framework are things that you probably heard of like React, Vue, Svelte, Ruby on Rails, I think, not sure actually. But yeah, JavaScript front-end frameworks. Then we also have server frameworks. So they're less known, but maybe Laravel's one. Um, Others are JavaScript like Express.js, Nitro, etc., etc. So yeah, now there's a big gap, if you notice, between the JavaScript framework and the server framework. How do we actually connect the two? Kasi we can't just have them isolated, right? We need connections for the application to work. We need parts to communicate with one another. And the easiest way to do that, in my experience, is using something called a meta framework. So a meta framework encompasses a JavaScript front-end framework and a server framework. Now, it might change the syntax of the things that it encompasses, but in general, it does this so that it helps us connect these two in a very parang understandable way, very simple way. Alright, so yun, meta framework. Examples of this is Next.js, Nuxt, SvelteKit. Okay, we'll go into that later. So again, JavaScript framework, server framework connected with a meta framework. So the meta framework is the bridge from the front end to the back end API. Okay, so how about database? So databases currently are split into two main types. We have the SQL databases like MySQL, PostgreSQL, etc. And then we have the NoSQL databases. So NoSQL databases are like Firestore, MongoDB, and etc. There are more for very specific uses like vector databases and etc. etc. But 90% of the time, you're gonna use either SQL or NoSQL databases. If you're ever confused, just know that everything you can do in SQL and NoSQL databases, they're like, you can do everything in both of them, basically. The difference is just the nuance of how they store data. So you could go more into that details. However, in my experience, parang this decision is heavily dependent later on in the process pa. This is especially true because the way we connect the server API to database is through the ORM. So if you remember a while ago, we mentioned the Object Relational Mapping Library. So this is, in my experience, the best way to connect the server framework to the database. The reason why is because of additional features it might have, like security features and optimization features. For example, kasi if you write raw SQL from the server framework to the database, SQL injections and other things can seep in, but the ORM is a natural way to like parang keep it clean. But there's always trade-off. Na the ORM might slow down, parang the transfer in between. But that's usually not a big deal unless you're really running with like gigabytes and millions of users. So yeah, just use an ORM. Okay, moving on. So we've talked a lot about the back end. Let's go back to the front end. So in the front end, we have things that can help the front end framework. So there's a lot of things that can help the front end framework, but two of the main ones are called a CSS framework and a UI library. A UI library is very important, I think, in starting, because that way you don't have to create every single element in a website like from scratch. UI libraries are very helpful in saving so much time because they are pre-made assets that are common in everywhere in the web, and at the same time have like animations and like just the final lap talaga to make something look professional. Kasi you know, when you open a website, right, there's like this expectation already that, oh, buttons will look something like this, or like the text will move slowly in this direction when you press an accordion, parang ganun. Or like when you hover, there's a color like that. These expectations aren't built um, natively. You have to build them by scratch. But now you can do that um, parang easier using presets basically. And CSS frameworks, so these are just parang quality of life frameworks that can help you do your styling a lot easier. Yeah, do your styling a lot easier because CSS is quite a handful and it can really get complicated. So yeah, this is, I guess you could say, a very brief like look at what a tech stack would look like. However, there come some issues with this. So actually, it's good practice to bundle all of this together in something like Docker. So Docker is a containerizer or for containers. The main use of having Docker is so that everything is parang packaged together. And so when you share it with other people, other developers, they run the Docker container instead of each of these items individually. The benefit of this is basically if it runs on my computer, I'm 100% sure it'll run on your computer if you use the Docker image or Docker container, right? But if you had to set it up individually, think about it this way. Let's say you're here, right? You're in this step, and I shared my project with you. Then you have to set up your database, you have to set up your ORM, you have to set up your meta framework, your UI, your CSS framework. Like technically, you already have all the code, but you still have to set it up. You still have to download software. You still have to parang add environment variables. Like there's a lot of stuff that actually goes into making a project run. So to simplify that with like a single command, we have Docker. Then outside naman of the project, so you could say Docker encompasses the actual project that's being shipped, right? The actual project of the app. There are dev tools, so developers tools. Developer tools are things that are only on the development side and they're not actually part of the final product. An example is a linter. So a linter is what's used to check for errors in your code. It's like the one that spots errors. We have a formatter. A formatter is the one that cleans up the code so that it looks consistent. Like for example, having the right amount of white spaces or tabs, having spaces between here and there, organizing your imports, basically to make everything look organized, clean, without actually changing any syntax. Linters naman, they complain about syntax. It's like, oh, you didn't use this import, you should remove it so that smaller bundle size. Or basically, linters are the ones that check for errors. Formatters make the code pretty. Next, we have Postman. Postman is an example of a software that you can use to check your server API, specifically like the routes into the server API and what comes out. That way, you don't have to keep working on the meta framework just to test your server framework. You can just use Postman. Then, of course, we have GitHub. GitHub is for sharing your code to the world, showing it to the world, but also It's just collaborating with other developers on the same code so that it's a very seamless process. Finally, we have VS Code, the code editor, where you actually, work, where you actually code. Okay, wow. So this is a lot to take in. There's a lot and a lot and a lot of technologies here, and in truth, you're gonna have to go into every single one of them one by one. However, just like the burger, there are certain order of things you go. Like the patty is more important than the lettuce. So likewise, there's also an order in what you should learn. So let's go first here. This is an example of a complete tech stack that I would use or I would even recommend. So for example, for the CSS framework, we have Tailwind CSS. For the UI framework, we have ShadCN UI. For the Meta framework, we have Next.js, and Next.js innately uses React and Nitro. Or we can use Drizzle because Drizzle is very fast and very similar to SQL. And we have Postgres SQL because, in my experience, the easiest database to host online is a Postgres SQL database. MySQL, there's so little options, and everything else uses no SQL database like MongoDB or Firestore. But Postgres SQL, it seems to be like the most popular parang hosting for some reason. I'm not sure why. But yeah, that's my suggestion. Although your choice for database almost never matters because you're always interacting anyway with your ORM. And so the ORM always translate it perfectly to your database. So switching database from MySQL, Postgres, MongoDB is quite literally one line of code. Like, what database are you using? And then you just put it there, and it will translate it for you. It almost doesn't matter what database you use. And for DevTools, I would say Biome is both a code linter and a formatter. People sometimes use ESLint as a linter and then Prettier as a formatter. But Biome is like the new thing now that can combine the two without you having to install these two things that can take you days to install because they hate each other for some reason and you gotta force them to fit in the project. I hate it so much. Of course, GitHub is a definite thing you need, and also Postman. There are very little things that can parang replace these two, so I just put them there as constant. And of course, VS Code, unless you prefer using something like Vim, although that is also a learning curve. So yeah, that is quite a lot. Also Docker. There are other ways to containerize things, but Docker is the standard. You should just use Docker. Okay. All right. Sorry. So yeah, that is everything. Quite a lot. If I were to recommend ways you'd learn it, I'd say the patty that you have to master first is Next.js. That is the most important thing. It's the core of your app, and then you can add things to it like Tailwind CSS, ShadCN UI, and then Drizzle to Postgres SQL. It looks complicated, but it's really not that bad. You just start with Next.js, and everything just branches out from it. So yeah, always start with the Meta framework. It's your bun. Oh, it's your patty, and then the buns are, I guess you could say Docker because it holds it together in a way. All right. So again, remember that this um specific tech stack is just an example. There are many other examples of other technologies. So let's go over them real quickly. So Tailwind CSS. This is the home site. It's Tailwind CSS. Another one is Uno CSS. If you like that, this is Uno CSS for your Tailwind for your CSS framework. For your let's see what was that. This was ShadCN UI. So the UI library is dependent usually on your meta framework. So for example, if you're using a meta framework called Nuxt, so Nuxt is the framework for Vue. Instead of React, you use Vue. You'd use Nuxt UI, and then there's also universal ones like Material UI. Yep. And then I think there's also Daisy UI. Yep. Quite a lot, honestly, because they're all really good, and it depends only how you want to customize it. Okay, next we have our for these ones, React and Nitro. I guess they're the server framework, and JS front-end framework. These are dependent on your meta framework usually. Although you could split them apart and you could make it yourself. Like you don't want a meta framework, that's totally fine with you. But I would advise against it if you're a beginner because it's so much easier if you follow the things meta framework, like the guidelines it gives you. So just do that. Good meta frameworks I would suggest are, of course, Next.js. Kasi React is a standard. Alright. Next is Nuxt, as I mentioned. Nuxt is the Vue framework. Vue is very popular also. We have SvelteKit. Svelte is part of the parang newer line of front-end frameworks. We have also Solid.js, Solid Start, Solid Start. Okay, that's not right. Solid Start JS. Yeah, this one. This is really good also. This one. And then we also have Quick City, if you want to try that one. There's also there's a lot, there's also what's that? Uh, it was Angular Analog. Yep, we have Analog JS for Angular, right? And yeah, meta frameworks have a lot of stuff in them, not just the front end framework and the what do you call this, the web framework. They have a lot of stuff in them, so it's really helpful to just use a meta framework instead of having to set it all up. There's really a lot. I'd say the simplest one to start with is SvelteKit. It's like the Python of this community, where it's like the simplest way to start, but you know, not necessarily the best way to start. I'd still say it might be best if you start with Next.js since it teaches you quite a lot. I personally started with Nuxt, and things transfer naman, stuff you learn will transfer to other places. So it's not bad. All of them in a way point back to each other. Just don't use analog. It'll it'll hurt you inside. Alright, next we have the ORM. There are two main ORMs that you have to use unless your framework specifically has only a specific framework, or like for example Firebase has their own ORM, and not Postman, Pocket Base has its own ORM, etc., etc. But the main ones you can use is Drizzle ORM. This is really fast and it's very SQL like, so it's very easy to pick up. And there's also Prisma IO. So Prisma IO, I've used this personally and it's so easy. Like it's so simple. It's like it's like Python. It's like the simplest possible way to do it. But yeah, up to you if you want to use Prisma or Drizzle. The Prisma is a bit slower, but it's not that slow. It's like again Python to C++. You learn more C++ technically, but Python's slower, but it's so easy to understand. Again, so yeah, you'll either use Drizzle or Prisma. I get database, just use Postgres, SQL, MongoDB maybe, but it doesn't really matter since you're gonna use an ORM. What matters is native data types, but you'll go into that when you need to. And yeah, that's everything I think. And again, I'd like to emphasize on the burger because, you might have been so busy thinking about cooking the burger, making the burger. Now you have to think, you didn't realize about how you're gonna serve the burger. Yeah, there you go. So this is when you deploy a site. Deploying sites, you don't usually think about it, but if you're thinking of a real project, you should think about how you're gonna get it to the customer. Is it gonna be on a plastic plate? Is it gonna be on a silver platter? How much is that gonna cost? How long are you gonna do that? Like hosting is something like an entire field just on itself. But as long as you follow the rule of like being able to containerize it in a Docker container, you will not have to worry that much about hosting. And plus, like hosting is again the final step, so you don't have to worry about it yet. You can focus on making your burger first. But yes, it is something that you sometimes have to think about before you start. So yeah, in the next video, I will start uh parang more step by step on how to you make a base project of this tech stack specifically. All right. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.